Section 111 is my all-time favorite because it shows that Joseph is still a treasure digger at heart. It's a treasure digging story. After the temple was completed in 1836, the church had a lot of debt because this was an incredible building built on a lot of poverty, which meant that somebody had to carry the can, and that was the leadership of the church because they had borrowed a great deal to make this happen. So when Joseph learned that there was some treasure in Salem, Massachusetts, he organized his closest associates to go on a treasure hunt. A guy named Burgess, who Don Carlos, Joseph's brother, was close to, told them that a widow had a house and there was some money, some treasure under the house that only he might know about. And so Joseph took Sidney Rigdon, his brother Hiram, Oliver Cowdery, and himself, the four of them, and they went to Salem to search for this treasure. And Joseph got this revelation to confirm that yes, there was treasure there and that they would be able to satisfy their debts. Verse 2, I have much treasure in the city for you. Verse 4, its wealth pertaining to gold and silver shall be yours. Concern not yourselves about your debts, for I will give you power to pay them. And Joseph is obviously concerned about Zion because verse 6 says, I will be merciful with her. And the revelation went on to say there are more treasures than one for you in the city. Therefore be wise as serpents and yet without sin, and I will order all things for your good. But despite having a powerful seer stone, Joseph could not locate the house or at least secure the fortune that was there waiting for him to be able to release the church from debt. Instead, basically, the four men had a bit of a holiday in the eastern United States, traveling around and visiting various places while they tried to figure out what to do. And back home, things were deteriorating quickly. So they had a holiday, but everybody else was in panic mode. But what I love most about this is that this really harkens back to Joseph's roots in the magic world, digging for treasure, going on adventures with his friends, and this was something that was quite big and important to him. And of course, he did it many times during his life, and it also is part of the Book of Mormon, of course, because there's a lot of quests where four brothers end up doing these kinds of treasure-seeking activities. And of course, in the early part of the church, with the Canadian Revelations, 4 people sent off to secure that copyright, which didn't happen. And this is also a case where, they might have been well-meaning and they wanted this treasure so badly and they did all the things that they thought were right, but this treasure was not secured. So we're now skipping ahead over a year to July 1837 for section 112. As you can imagine, a lot has happened in this time frame. And the biggest thing that's happened, of course, is because that treasure dig was not successful in Salem, Massachusetts, Joseph and Sidney and Oliver and Hiram have come back to Kirtland and had to figure out another way to raise some funds. And they decided to start a bank. So Oliver was sent to New York to get plates for printing of banknotes, and this was done while Joseph tried to secure a banking charter for which he couldn't get. So when Oliver came back with the plates, he then just printed anti-bank on the notes, and these were then let out to the public. Now this was effectively counterfeiting, and when the US government started to clamp down on unauthorized banks in early 1837, this bank collapsed, and it collapsed spectacularly, taking a lot of funds of prominent members with it. Imagine losing your life savings to a prophet of God who promised you that God was backing this bank to succeed so that you would have plenty of money and the church's debt would be taken care of. So there's a lot of unhappy campers in Kirtland, and many of them are members of the Quorum of the 12 because these are the prominent members who have put up their own funds. So this revelation is actually to Thomas B. Marsh, who is the president of the Quorum of the 12. Now, he's living in Missouri, and this doesn't really affect him that much, or at least he hasn't put money into this scheme, which has fallen over. But he's hearing about many of these apostles, which he's supposed to be over, who are now basically speaking terribly about Joseph Smith. So he's come to Kirtland to try and sort this out. And this is the revelation that Joseph gets for him. Another thing that's happening is that Joseph is calling the 12 and sending them on missions to England. And President Thomas B. Marsh, he's supposed to be in charge of these apostles, and he's not being informed of these decisions. And so he's a little grumpy about that. The revelation takes him to task by saying that his heart is not quite right, but he is forgiven of the Lord. He's told to humble himself and that the Lord has heard his prayers concerning his brethren, and he should pray for the 12 and admonish them sharply for God's sake. God says that after their temptations and much tribulation, if they repent, they will be converted and God will heal them. But that all of the 12 are required to take up their cross. And by this he means that cross of being really disappointed by God and Joseph that these funds in the Kirtland Safety Society are lost. Thomas is assured that he is, as president of the Quorum of the 12, in charge of unlocking the door of the kingdom in terms of missionary work. But also that he has to take direction from the first presidency. And what's really interesting about this is that the first presidency is now designated Joseph, Sidney, and Hiram, because Frederick G. Williams is now faltering because of this bank. God assures Thomas that darkness covers the earth and everything is corrupt, and that God's vengeance is coming speedily to the earth. And this is the last days and the last time that missionaries will be sent out. And of course, this hasn't come to pass 200 years later. But the revelation is adamant that God is coming quickly and his reward is going to be there for those who have kept faithful. And Thomas B. Marsh is going to be faithful. He's going to hold to Joseph and he's going to protect him. But this is going to come to an end in a year's time when Thomas B. Marsh is president of the Quorum of the 12, when Sidney and Joseph have fled to Missouri and are now enacting punishment on the people of Missouri. Thomas B. Marsh, as president of the Quorum of the 12 and as an apostle of Jesus Christ, is going to determine that these people are acting against the church and against God. And so he's going to testify to Missouri Governor Boggs that the Mormons are not right, that they're carrying out a Gadianton type operation. And this is going to mean the expulsion of the Mormons from Missouri. So at the moment, he's incredibly faithful and he's holding on, but in a year's time, he's going to be out. Doctrine and Covenants 113 is almost a whole year later, March of 1838. And things have deteriorated in Kirtland. Joseph is the subject of a number of lawsuits about particularly the loss of the Kirtland Bank Society and on all the funds of the members. There's a large-scale apostasy in Kirtland where half of the Quorum of the 12 and many prominent members are now speaking against Joseph. The three witnesses, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer, are all out of the church or soon to be excommunicated. And Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith have fled Kirtland. They've taken their families and they've headed to far west Missouri, where the bulk of the other saints are. Along the way, Joseph has got some revelations, which never get canonized, that basically say that the first presidency is above the church and nobody can hold them to account, which is a complete reversal of the common consent rules, including the idea that equal quorums keep the church in check and balance. Before he's arrived in Far West, he's asked Thomas B. Marsh to clear house in Missouri because the state presidency there is, of course, David Whitmer, and he has to go. So in March of 1838, Joseph has arrived in Far West Missouri, beleaguered because the church in Kirtland has basically fallen, and he has to establish some kind of prophetic ability above others because his authority is in jeopardy. So this section is really an explanation of some parts of Isaiah that Joseph is going to use to establish himself as the rightful heir of God's promises. Citing passages of Isaiah was a really big deal in June of 1829 with the Book of Mormon to buy in the witness into this particular project. And he's using the same technique again here in Far West to buy in the members that they're a part of something great. These question and answers, which come in a form of kind of revelation, suggest, well, the first question is, who is the stem of Jesse? And second, verily, thus saith the Lord, it is Christ, which is slightly weird because, of course, Christ is speaking in the third person about himself, if this is a revelation from Christ, or we're still doing that whole kind of modalist type understanding that, God is speaking, and he's speaking as Christ sometimes, and he's speaking about himself as Christ at other times. The second question asks, what is the rod spoken of in the first verse of the 11th chapter of Isaiah? And the answer is, behold, thus saith the Lord, it is a servant in the hands of Christ. And again, he's alluding to himself, Joseph is. What is the root of Jesse? Well, behold, just thus saith the Lord, it is a descendant of Jesse as well as of Joseph, to whom rightly belongs the priesthood. Again, Joseph is establishing himself as fulfilling this scripture. Question by Elias Higby, what is meant by the command in Isaiah 52, put on thy strength? Well, those whom the God should call in the last days, who should hold the power of the priesthood to bring against Zion. So in this way, he's elevating those around him who are now supporting him in the wake of this great fall of Kirtland. And the last question seeks an understanding of the passage that says Zion is loosing herself from the bands of her neck. And the explanation given is that it's the scattered remnants of the house of Israel, and these remnants who are cursed by God and are now in their scattered condition among the Gentiles. So these are the Native Americans and also the Jews who have been undermined because they haven't recognized Jesus, and they need to have the gospel. There's missionary work to do. So as Joseph and Sydney arrive in Far West, they are now trying to establish their dominance and their prophetic ability in Missouri, because up until this point, Joseph hasn't lived in Missouri, and these people have been out here for a long time. And while he is still the head of the church, he needs to show them that he is the one that's fulfilling prophecy, and if they support him, they will be blessed exceedingly, and everything will be okay, because right now it's all in turmoil. Section 114, given in April of 1838, is to this man, David Patten, who is an original apostle in the Quorum of the 12. The apostles were ordered by seniority, and so that made Thomas B. Marsh the president, David Patten the next, and Brigham Young the next after that. And so these three were the presidency in Missouri after the stake of Missouri had been dissolved by the court done by Thomas B. Marsh, and this was awaiting Joseph and Sydney and Hiram, who were coming from Kirtland and fleeing the church dissolution there. Part of the apostles' responsibilities were to go out and preach, and they were planning this mission to go to England, and some had already gone. It was a big success, and David Patten wanted to go too, but he had debts, and so he had petitioned the church in Missouri to relieve him of his debts so that he could go. Now that the first presidency were in Missouri, Joseph got this revelation to call David Patten on a mission the following spring to do this important work. Verily, thus saith the Lord, which has now become code word for Joseph speaking on behalf of Jesus. And this becomes a really big thing in the church. And we're seeing it more and more at this particular point, because, of course, Joseph has to exert his authority because it's in jeopardy currently. And he's telling David Patten that he must perform a mission to God. And this mission is supposed to be next spring. So this is already spring in 1838, and it's going to be a whole nother year, and David is supposed to fulfill his mission. But for right now, he's going to just be in charge and take care of things in Missouri. And what God doesn't know, because Joseph doesn't know this, is that David Patten is going to be involved in the conflicts in Missouri, and he's going to die as a result of that warfare that happens in the Mormon-Missouri War in October of 1838, so only 6 months from now. And senior apostle and president Thomas B. Marsh is going to be so distraught by all of this violence that is being enacted by members of the church in a Gadianton-style robbery. He's going to go to the governor of Missouri. He's going to, along with Orson Hyde, testify that the saints are a threat. Therefore, he's going to leave the church and be excommunicated. Because David Patten is now dead, Brigham Young is going to become the president of the Quorum of the 12. And when the members are kicked out of Missouri, and Joseph and Sidney and others are being held in Liberty Jail for treason, Brigham Young is the one who organizes all of that logistics and gets them to Quincy, Illinois. And so he becomes really important to Joseph Smith and to the church. But for now, this revelation is only 2 verses. And the second one basically says, inasmuch as there are those among you who deny my name, others shall be planted in their seed. And this, of course, is because there's this huge amount of dissension in the church, and lots of those apostles have now left, and so basically God is going to provide anew. And this is just the way that those who remain are being elevated against those who have left. Now, because this revelation contains what is essentially a prophecy, it's a command for David Patten to serve a mission next spring, and he dies, this revelation, this prophecy is not included in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants that Joseph compiles, but it is put into the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants that Orson Pratt compiles, because by that point David Patten's name is not quite as associated with the events of the time. Happy 4th of July, Independence Day. And today's section, 115, really has a lot to do with the 4th of July, and I will explain. This is the Temple Lot in far west Missouri. Now, there isn't a temple there, but this is where it was supposed to be according to this particular revelation. This is again in April of 1838, and Joseph is getting a number of revelations at this particular point because the church is basically having to reset, because Kirtland is lost and Joseph is establishing his authority, and he's doing it through revelation in Missouri. And just like the last revelation, what happens in this section doesn't come to pass, and so it's not included in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants. But we're grateful to Orson Pratt, who revives these revelations and puts them in the 1876 version of the Doctrine and Covenants. This revelation is a general revelation to the First Presidency, Edward Partridge as the bishop, the High Council in Missouri, and also the people of Missouri. Verse 4 changes the name of the church to be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is 1838. So what is happening here? Well, the first name of the church was the Church of Christ in April of 1830, and that's how the church operated for about 4 years. But the problem was that the United Order and Firm, which Joseph had debts associated with, was causing some problems and some lawsuits. And so they changed the name of the church to the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which is how it was in Kirtland with the Kirtland Temple. But of course, now the Kirtland Temple has fallen into debt and is now subject of legal and lawsuits, and so Joseph is trying to get away from some of these other things, plus too the dropping of Jesus Christ from the name in 1834 caused some problems. And so now, in order to establish a new legal identity, the church is being renamed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And while this section does not make the distinction, when Brigham Young goes to Utah, he changes the name again, just where the hyphen and the capitalization of the word day is concerned, in order to make it a completely new identity legally, because the church had changed and this previous church has debts. Which suggests it's not about God and the name of the church, it's about responsibility, particularly legal responsibility, because lots of the things that the church president does, particularly at this point Joseph, is problematic. And Joseph commands a gathering in far west Missouri because Kirtland is now lost and the saints need somewhere to go, particularly those who are still going to follow Joseph from Kirtland. They're going to come in droves to Missouri. This is going to upset the locals, of course, but Joseph explains in verse 6 that this is for a defense and for a refuge, because the pouring out of the wrath of God is going to happen imminently. Far west is designated holy and consecrated land, and the saints are commanded to build a house of worship, a temple in far west. And this is supposed to commence on the 4th day of July. So in a couple of months or 6 weeks from this particular revelation. And this is Independence Day. It's the new church's Independence Day with a new foundation for a temple. Because Joseph liked his life in Kirtland and loved having a temple that was special and elevated him and the church, and he's going to replicate Kirtland in far west. And the 4th of July is going to be really important because the cornerstone is going to be laid on the 4th of July, 1838. But a year from now was when they're going to commence laying the foundation and build up this temple. And verse 13 is not going to repeat the mistakes of the past, because Joseph and Sidney and Hiram are not supposed to attach themselves in any way to the debt that it will take to build this temple in far west. But it's really important that they do this temple, and it's really important that they do it a certain way, because God will not accept it if they don't do it a certain way. And the city of far west needs to be built up speedily for the gathering of the saints. This is now the new promised land. And so God and Joseph are planning for a grand future, and they don't know that the saints are going to get kicked out of Missouri by the end of this year of 1838, and none of this is going to come to pass. Which is why this memorial exists in far west, and I've been to it, but there is no temple there, and the cornerstone is there, but they never built this temple. And because they can't go back to Jackson County, Missouri, and in fact, they're now selling off their lands, Joseph needs to designate something as special in this land, and he designates a nearby county, place called Spring Hill, as the place that Adam will come to visit his people, and this is Adam-ondi-Ahman. So while the saints have lost their specific place in Missouri, the promised spot that the temple and the New Jerusalem will be, God has provided for them a new special land, the place where Adam had the Garden of Eden, where Adam will visit his people as the father of everything. And so the cornerstone is laid on July the 4th, 1838, and Sidney Rigdon gives a fiery sermon about how important it is, that gathering, and how this is the new promised land, and how the Missouri people who are already there have to make way for the saints because God has decreed that this land is important. And you can imagine that the sermon, which was printed and passed out to people, went down like a lead balloon, and of course started an ongoing conflict that led to the Missouri Mormon War and the expulsion of the saints from the state of Missouri. So, happy Independence Day, Missouri Church, 1838. William Marks is primarily the subject of section 117, but there are others in it too, and it's a revelation dated the 8th of July, 1838, so after Independence Day in far west Missouri, as Joseph is trying to consolidate the church and make it something in Missouri. When the First Presidency fled Kirtland, there were still some things unresolved, and so the people that were left behind to take care of everything while the evacuation of Kirtland was happening for those who wanted to follow Joseph, William Marks, who had been designated the Kirtland stake president, and Neill K. Whitney, who was the bishop in Kirtland, had remained to settle the affairs, try and do whatever they could to preserve as much as they could for the church and for Joseph. It was dangerous for Joseph and Sidney to go back to Kirtland. They would have absolutely have been arrested, but it could have been much worse, and so they weren't going to go anywhere near Ohio. And gosh, it was such a long way, 800 miles, nobody's going to come for them, really. The revelation suggests that William Marks needs to speedily settle up the business in Missouri. And I love the lyrical words, before I, the Lord, send again the snows upon the earth. So, yeah, winter. And they're told not to tarry in Kirtland. Things might not go so well. It doesn't really elaborate what this could be, but I think Joseph is anxious to have William, who is a staunch supporter, in Missouri with him, but also he's kind of worried that anybody left behind will be swept up with the anti-Joseph ideology that is prevalent in that place. The revelation also says that the properties of Kirtland should be let out for debts, just let them go. And this is an idea that Kirtland, which they had imagined was going to be their sanctuary and their stake, is now just being completely abandoned. The revelation saying that God can turn this land, Missouri, into a blossoming rose is magical thinking. And this is actually one of the big underpinnings of this whole problem between Kirtland and Missouri. Ohio was part of that glacier melt in the last ice age that pushed a lot of fertile soil into the region. So Ohio was incredibly productive. Missouri, on the other hand, is not. The production of a farm in Ohio compared to Missouri was 3-1 in Joseph's day. And so that was one of the really big underpinnings of the economic disparity and between those two states and that kind of land. And this affected the saints because, of course, as Missouri was the promised land, the saints were expecting to be really blessed, but they weren't as blessed as the people in Ohio, which meant, Joseph wanted to stay there where economy was better and where civilization was better. And he's now promising these refugees in Missouri that God is going to change the land for their benefit. And this is never going to happen, because if God was responsible for the Ice Age thousands of years ago, he's already set the stage for why Ohio is much more productive than Missouri. So this revelation says, come, bring the saints. It's going to be amazing and wonderful. Missouri is going to be fabulous for us. It's our inheritance. And of course, we've just talked about how Sidney Rigdon in his July 4th oration basically says, this is our land, this is the promised land, this is Zion, and God has promised it to us, and be damned, all you Missourians. The Lord is going to rain down his fury on you. And of course, this is the lighting the fire for the powder keg that is going to be the Mormon-Missouri War. William Marks was the stake president in Kirtland, and then he becomes the stake president in Nauvoo, which is huge. He's a very vital part of this puzzle, and he has as much power as Brigham Young does in this time period as the stake president. Neill K. Whitney is the bishop, and he's told to come to Missouri too. Edward Partridge is already there in Far West, but Neill K. Whitney has promised that he's going to be bishop of a nearby area, Adam-on-Diamond, and this is going to be blossom like a rose. People are going to come. That's where Joseph is going to settle them. So this is going to be really important too. And we still see at this stage this idea of being against secret combinations and abominations, the secret band that is referenced in Revelation. And Joseph is still setting the church out as being different from the Gadianton robbers. But of course, in a couple of months' time, the church is going to involve itself with the Danites, and then Thomas B. Marsh is going to defect on the basis that the church is acting like the Gadianton robbers. The section finishes with some thoughts about Oliver Granger. Now, Oliver Granger is being left behind in Kirtland to settle up any loose ends for the church and for Joseph. And, he's not coming across to Missouri, or at least not for a while. And so Joseph in here is trying to suggest that Oliver Granger has been given a great charge, and we should thank him for his service and his sacrifice. Because by this point, Kirtland is lost. Any recovery that Oliver Granger can make is good, but he's likely to fail. And so Joseph is consolidating his power around Far West and making sure that he has his people, his supporters, in the places he wants, as these new Kirtland refugees are going to flock into Missouri. I'm going to do the next three sections, section 118, 119, and 120, all together, because they're received on the same day and they're all interconnected to each other. They were part of a conference in the wake of the July 4th reset of the church. And with this in mind, it was all about how to make the church now prominent and important and sustainable in Missouri. The First Presidency had effectively been kicked out of Kirtland, and they wanted to restore their power, but also clamp down on any dissonance. What is happening in the background is that, of course, there's those Missouri Saints, those early church leaders like Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and the Whitmers in general, who were backbone to the church in Missouri, and now they had been relieved. Sidney Rigdon preached a salt sermon on the 17th of June, basically saying, get out of town or we will hunt you down, and that's what they did. Sidney Rigdon's July 4th oration put the Missouri residents on notice that the church was here to stay and it would be making a big splash, and if they had any resistance, there would be a war of extermination against Missouri people. And so that there was no mistake that anybody should not know this, they printed lots of copies and they distributed them to nearby towns. And backing all of this was the organization of the Danites, which was a paramilitary operation organized like an army to back the words of the president and the church leaders with force. So when these revelations were received on July 8th, 1838, it comprised of the First Presidency, those apostles who were there in Missouri, and also these Danite military command leaders. So one of the first things to do with this conference was to replace those apostles which had apostatized in Kirtland and which were no longer supporting the church. Thomas B. Marsh, who was a president of the Quorum of the 12, was told to tarry in Zion, till lots of this stuff could be worked out, and the idea that the 12 would be provided for and their families provided for, especially as they worked to the idea that they were going to leave on missions. And this was designated to take place on the 26th day of April next year, so 1829. Now, I told you something wrong before. I told you that these apostles snuck back to Far West, to the temple lot, on July 4th, 1839, but it's actually the 26th day of April. And that's what they did because, of course, the members had been kicked out of Missouri by the end of this year. And we see some new appointments. John Taylor, John Page, Wilford Woodruff, and Willard Richards are now going to be anointed as apostles. And these people becoming incredibly important to the church and to the loyalty of Joseph going on, especially in Nauvoo. Section 119 talks about a financial preparation underpinning the church. And it codified the idea of tithing, and that people needed to consecrate their surplus property and then tithe, which was now being defined as 1/10 of their interest, their income to the church for a perpetual money option for financing what great plans Joseph had. This was also designated to replace the law of consecration, which had fallen over many years before, and which Joseph still just couldn't get up and running again. And this is also in response to a plea from Joseph and Sydney, particularly, that they should get paid for their office in the church. And that had been signed off by the High Council the month before, but when they presented it to the general membership, the membership rejected it. And so instead, this was going to be the mechanism by which everybody was provided for. So the surplus property would be put into the hands of the bishop, and this would go towards the building of the temple and for the debts of the presidency of the church. So again, effectively paying them from past stuff that they've already spent. And this is designated as the tithing of the people. And the voice of God is commanding the people that they need to do this. And so all those who are going to gather, because they're still coming from Kirtland, shall be tithed of their surplus property. So effectively, given it's not a tenth, all of their surplus property is going to be taken, and that they observe this law, or else they will not be found worthy. And if the people don't observe this law, they're not going to have Zion. So it's a big deal. And the reason that the Danite leaders are at this meeting, this group, is because they're going to be the enforcers. They're going to make sure and audit and get these surplus properties and make the people comply with this law. And section 120, because remember the previous revelation said that this surplus property would go to the bishop, and that was Bishop Partridge. But section 120 is just one verse that basically says this money and property will go to a council comprised of the first presidency of the church, the bishop, and the high council. So it's not just Bishop Partridge now, because of course Joseph and Sydney and Hiram, they all need to be paid. And so that's how the financial capital is going to be re-established, and how the leadership capital is going to be re-established with those who are now appointed to fill the seats of those who have left.